Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. It's a sad irony that at a time when the conflicts of the Middle East involve us so deeply, we know so little about the popular attitudes and political aspirations of the region's peoples. Ultimately, it will of course be those passions and the zeal with which they are pursued that will determine the region's destiny. One journalist whose work has been remarkable for its insight into the beliefs and frustrations of Middle Easterners is Anthony Shadid, Islamic affairs correspondent for the Washington Post. The recipient of many awards, including a Pulitzer-prize in 2004, he's widely cited for his exceptional ability to capture the voices and emotions of a turbulent region. Anthony, welcome back to Dialogue.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
I've looked forward to this for quite a while, Anthony.
Likewise.
Keep in touch with you through the papers, so to speak. Let me start with one of my personal curiosities, indeed fascinations. We, of course, I only have to say the word Iraq for everyone to know just how contentious that is in this country and how sharp the political debate is getting. I think it's a safe statement, Anthony. The Americans have very little sense of how Iraqis view our presence there. And I'm wondering, from your time and your reportage, is there any consensus among the Iraqi population about the American presence in that country? Do they want us to stay, go? Or is it just a welter of opinions?
You know, I think it was a remarkable welter of opinions, you know, as you put it, early on. And I think especially in those first few weeks, months, 2003, to be specific, after the invasion and after the fall of Saddam Hussein. You know, I remember very vividly standing in the street, I think it was Sa'adun Street, leading up to where the statue was pulled down.
Right.
In some ways a seminal moment of what the invasion was all about. And I remember interviewing people along that street, and it struck me, the sentiments even on that day, a very tumultuous day. A third of the people I talked to were upset what was happening. They felt Baghdad had become occupied. A third of the people were jubilant. Saddam Hussein, he was a tyrant, he had fallen. And a third of the people were, you know, let's wait and see what happens. What are their intentions? And that was always a phrase you'd hear, what are their intentions? Right. I have to say, I think, you know, there has been an arc in a way in the sentiments of maybe all three groups. And I was struck in my last visit, which was 6 months ago now, at the end of last year, by how and this is going to sound perhaps somewhat strong, but I think how discredited the American project is at this point in Iraq. And it did strike me that no one believes in, I'm sure there are people here and there, but I think if you're talking about, you know, the majority of people or the vast majority of people, there's a deep disenchantment and disillusionment with what the Americans have brought to the country. That doesn't mean that there are people there who want the Americans to stay because they feel the alternative would be much worse. Right. That doesn't mean that there are people who regret, you know, think that it could have been better if some mistakes hadn't been made. But if you ask people what, you know, about the American project defined broadly, there's hardly any, I think, popular support for that idea.
Well, you know, the word disenchantment that you use in that answer, Anthony, goes right to the core of me, because I was familiar from your past writing, and particularly your book, Night Draws Near, with a quality that I think you credit Iraqis with traditionally, and that's resilience, the ability to bounce back. So when I hear the word disenchantment right now, I'm wondering about your perception of the survivability of that quality. Do you still think that resilience is there?
I think that's a great point, because it did strike me. I was working on a piece for the Washington Post, after that last trip about Baghdad itself, and I remember during the invasion, even before the invasion, and then in those very difficult months and years that followed, Baghdad did always have that, like you said, that resilience. It's people, and I remember so vividly during the invasion itself, when some of the worst nights of bombing, the next morning I'd wake up and look out, the window, and you'd see the streets, life returning to the streets. Cars would be back out, and this is after, a very difficult night. It did strike me, I think, in the last visit to Baghdad, that resilience wasn't there, and perhaps it's still there at some level, but there was such a depression isn't the right word, but there was such a deep, I think, sadness, mourning in a way of what the fate of Iraq had become at this point. And I heard this from friend after friend, just, a sense that maybe things had gone too far, that there wasn't a way to pull back.
That's very telling, Anthony. By my not so subtle calculation, Iraqis have been experiencing war or war-related deprivation for about a quarter century now. And it would seem to me that it would be very hard to maintain any sense of the future with that kind of thing going on.
Yeah, that's so true. And that, when I was writing Night Draws Near, part of me wanted to spend, a fourth of the book on the trauma that Iraq has gone through since, as you put it, a quarter century. I mean, to me, one of the most defining moments of that, or one of the most difficult moments of that traumatic experience we're talking about, is the war with Iran.
Exactly.
An 8-year war that lasted, 1 million dead or injured on both sides. It's just an incredibly traumatic episode that indelibly shaped Iraq, and I think and it continues to shape Iraq even amid the chaos and anarchy we see today.
Again, you use a key word, Anthony, and again, I relate it to things that you've written that I well remember, the word trauma, a traumatized country. And in this instance, I'm mindful, and I hope I got it right, you'll certainly tell me if I didn't, of criticism, perhaps very, very vibrant among Iraqis, that among the failures of this occupation were a failure to appreciate two things: the importance of Iraq's history to Iraqis, that Americans came in there without a full understanding of that, and the degree to which this is indeed a traumatized, a bruised, a wounded country, that we have not been as sensitive to those issues as we might have been. I
think that's exactly right. Those are the two issues that I would see as the biggest. If we look at, mistakes, placed in the biggest categories, I think that's exactly right. And I think, I've always been struck by this one unintended consequence, I think, that came out of the occupation was that, I think the American administration, or what served as the administration in Iraq after the fall of Saddam, had a notion of Iraq as simply a country of Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites. And it was that on one level. There's no question about that. But it was also much more. It was much more complicated. There had been, movements that spanned sectarian and ethnic cleavages, in Iraq's earlier history in the 60s and the 70s. But the Americans were very much, set in this notion of three groups that made up Iraq. And in a lot of ways, the consequences of that understanding, or of those policies that followed, especially in that early year in 2003, right after the fall of Saddam, helped bring about that reality, helped create turned a misconception into a reality. And I think that's what we're dealing with today in a very visceral way.
To take up that point, if we have, in a sense, helped create this reality, what does that say about the future prospects of a unified country? I mean, has this introduction of division now been so strong that getting back to any sense of unity is foregone?
I think that's the most pressing question right now, and it was a question I asked a lot when I was there last time. And my sense, I think, in talking to people and being there the last time I was that the short term and the medium term is going to be very, very difficult. I still do hold out hope, and I take that hope from some of the conversations I had with people, that there is a possibility of reconciliation down the road. That prospect of reconciliation, to me, is very difficult to see as long as the American military is present in Iraq in the scope that it is today. I mean, the Americans are going to always be seen as the final arbiter, even if they're not. They're going to have that image as being the arbiter of these conflicts or these struggles that are going on inside Iraq. Once they're removed, once Iraqis are forced to make some kind of a reconciliation, or to deal with each other on their own, I do see the possibility of some kind of, reconciliation might be too strong a word, but civil wars do come to an end. And you have examples of countries like Lebanon, which people thought the civil war there would never end, and it did. It's shaky today, but I do have a little bit of, I have to say, a little bit more optimism about the long term than anything else.
That they can forge an accommodation, so to speak.
It's not going to be easy, and I think this war that's going on there right now is going to last quite a while. Right. But I do think it will someday come to an end, and I don't think it has to come to an end with the destruction of Iraq as a country, as a state.
As a unified state.
Right.
Your brief, Anthony, of course, is it's the Islamic world broadly taken. And while Iraq is a big part of that, I want to also discuss some of the broader themes that you also deal, I think, with very, very constructively. And one of the most important, I got this from Legacy of the Prophet, and I think it's a factor in Iraq, it's a factor in Iran, all the countries that we're going to be talking about. And that's the influence of political Islam, which as a phenomena perhaps we here don't have a full understanding of. I think if I mention that term just publicly right now, the reaction would be, oh, that's terrorism, or that's fundamentalism. But I think your argument is that in places like Iraq, throughout the region and throughout the Islamic world, political Islam is a very varied phenomenon, a very important one, and one which has to be factored in any hopes for democracy. Is that right? I
think that's exactly right. And I think that, as you pointed out, I think the lens that we see the Middle East or the Arab world typically through these days is this lens of terrorism. And it's a very abstract concept. It doesn't, in some ways it's meaningless, I think, when we're trying to understand these societies and what shapes these societies. But when we talk about this phrase political Islam, I mean, to me that is the most pressing in a way, concept to understand right now. If we're going to try to understand how states like Egypt, like Lebanon, like Syria, like Jordan are shaping, right, and what their kind of trajectory is toward the future. I mean, what political Islam suggests is, I mean, to me at least, it suggests is a society coming to terms with its identity and trying to find a way to express that identity through politics. And I think that's what we're dealing with political Islam in some ways. I find it a vibrant movement. I find it a lot of diversity within its ranks, and a lot of, I think I've always been surprised when talking to Islamic activists about some of the soul searching and the self-criticism they're going through and trying to come up with ideas and answers. It's an incredibly, I think, precarious moment.
It sounds much more intellectually engaged than I would have thought. I mean, it's an agreement that, I mean, a movement that's taking a very self-critical look at itself. Is that correct?
And I don't want to say that's across the board. That would be misleading. I mean, there are some very militant, very radical elements, you know, within what I guess we would call political Islam. But I think, you know, the more mainstream elements within that group are saying things that weren't being said 20 years ago, are saying things that are controversial in their own terms, and are saying things as part of this soul searching and this self-criticism in order to find a way forward.
Would you say, Anthony, that it's important for us to understand that because they are undertaking this kind of effort, that we have to understand that any conception of democracy in that region is going to have to make a place for this?
See, this is a key point. I think that's an incredibly crucial point, what you just said. And this is where I find there's a certain divorce, I think, between American policy in the region right now and the idea of the evolution of democratic societies. You know, the United States, let's look at Egypt, for instance, where you have the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, does the Muslim Brotherhood represent a third of Egyptian society, half, a quarter? You know, it's up to debate, but, you know, whatever number we decide on, it's a very significant current within the Egyptian population. Now, the American government doesn't want to deal with the Brotherhood as part of the political system, nor does the Egyptian government, obviously. But how do you have a democratic life in Egypt emerge without the participation of anywhere from a quarter to a half of the population? And I think that's one of the contradictions we're dealing with. Do we need to, rethink our perspective, our understanding of political Islam if we're going to really let these societies grow and mature in a democratic fashion? My sense is that there's no democratic future for any country in the Middle East without some kind of reconciliation, some kind of
and acceptance by outsiders of this reality.
Right.
I mean, you make me remember Algeria some years ago when it looked like Islamic. Well, in that case, people would have said extremist, but certainly a strong Islamic movement was poised to win, and the government just rejected the outcome.
That's right, and the cost that followed that. I mean, a horrific civil war that followed, and Egypt is in a very difficult moment right now. I mean, the government of President Hosni Mubarak is not going to tolerate the Brotherhood entering into politics in a very above-board fashion. Once he's gone, once there's a new government there, is there a possibility of change? Hopefully, because it is, not only dealing with I think a more just political system in some ways, that it's more representative.
Exactly.
But we're also looking at, when you look at Egypt, this monopoly on politics by in Egypt, Mubarak's monopoly on politics since 1981 at this point has led to an incredible stagnation, and Egypt, its standing in the region has withered. It's something very, very painfully felt by people that live in Egypt, what's happened to the country.
I appreciate that, because to me, Egypt is the biggest enigma in the region right now. Ostensibly the most powerful country, and yet it seems to me withdrawn, if you will, from the larger political debate in the region.
And I think you could make the argument, and there are a lot of other factors obviously going in, but the political stagnation of not being able to understand how the government is going to deal with its Islamic opposition, which is by far the greatest opposition. I think that political stagnation has kind of spilled into other areas of life there.
Exactly.
And it has led to this, very much Egypt's, the withering of Egypt's standing in the region when it was once the unquestioned leader of the Arab world.
I think that's exactly right. Again, on political Islam, Anthony, how do you rate? Well, that's an odd way to put it, but how do you characterize the importance of the Sunni Shiite schism? Some have said that this may be the most important and potentially dangerous of issues in political Islam today.
That's an interesting question, because I have to say I was very dismissive of this idea of a Sunni Shiite split, even maybe 3 years ago. But when you living in the region right now and reporting in the region, having conversations with people, seeing what leaders, politicians are talking about, it is a reality, and it is a reality that wasn't there before in the shape it is today. I think it's a reality that's being manipulated to some degree. I think both American policy has encouraged it. I think the leaders of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan have a stake in fomenting the strife a little bit between Sunnis and Shiites. But even beyond that, though, there is no question that it is felt at a popular level. It is shaping politics in the region, and it looks to be sharpening, I think, with the conflicts that are going on in the Middle East today.
Are there any forces that are working to moderate that split, that division too? Because, you know, one of them, Lebanon is one instance, but there are others in the region as well. This didn't used to be.
Exactly.
The fact. I mean, it's like a terrible regression.
And I think there is a popular resistance to this. I mean, time and again, I've heard, you know, a Palestinian friend of mine was just making the point the other day that, you know, that she didn't even know that she was Sunni or Shia when she was growing up. She was Muslim. And I think to a lot of people, this is alien, this idea of such a stark sectarian, you know, description of one's identity. I think that is foreign, somewhat alien to people. You know, can this resist what we're seeing, this kind of trend going toward a greater sectarian divide? I don't know, but you really, it's serving a lot of people's interest to keep that divide going and to even to make that divide deeper.
Yeah. So it's a force that's being manipulated right now.
I think it is. I think it fits into this conflict that's going on right now between the United States and Iran, you know, for supremacy in the region, and I think this is one of the manifestations of that conflict.
I'm glad you bring us to that, because I definitely want to talk about Iran and not just the conflict with us, but its role in the region, so to speak. In fact, and this reminds me also, Anthony, that you are also extremely well known for your coverage of the countries individually in the region. And I'd like to turn to a number of them in sequence, so to speak, starting with one that I know is very dear to you for reasons of family as well as reasons of professional interest, and that's Lebanon. How can one even characterize what's going on right now? I mean, everyone remembers that horrible 15-year-old civil war. And to me today, Anthony, just thinking of Lebanon right now with the military fighting the radicals coming out of the Palestinian camps, with the United Nations conducting the investigation in the Rafik Hariri's assassination, and also policing the South. The UN has a strong role in doing that. I'm just wondering, what does that tell us about the country? Is it so unstable that we have the risk of a broader breakdown here?
You know, I think we're dealing with such a, you know, I think it's probably one of the most difficult moments for the entire region right now, for the Middle East, and I have to say I'm pretty pessimistic about where things are headed in the Arab world. I think I'm even more pessimistic about Lebanon at this point. It is a country, I have family ties to it. Enjoy very much living there. It's the subject of my next book. But I have to say, living in Lebanon, I get very, very sad about where I see the country headed, because I think it is, in a lot of respects, already a failed state. And I think there are a lot of factors pushing that reality ahead in a pretty stark fashion.
A failed state as opposed to a failing one. You mean it's...
You know, a failing state might be a better description, to be honest. But I mean, if we look at, you know, what the government is today, its opposition, what's going on in the camps, that not a third of the country, but, you know, a large swath of southern Lebanon is under UN trusteeship. Basically, it's in the hands of UNIFIL. I mean, I think we are dealing with a state that's definitely not able to take care of itself. You know, is it failed at this point? It's coming very close to that.
Right.
I think.
But elections are scheduled for November, are they not, or for the latter part of this year?
Presidential elections, and I think that's what a lot of people see as the next crisis point. There's, in a way, the fundamental conflict, I think, in the country at this point is between the government. When I say the government, it's backed by the United States, backed by France. It's made up mainly of key elements of Lebanon's sectarian groups, the Sunni Muslims in particular. It's facing an opposition that's led by Hezbollah, which is Shiite Muslim, and also has, both sides have their Christian allies. That conflict is in a holding pattern in a little way. That struggle is in a holding pattern at this point. I think when we see that a new dynamic introduced into that conflict is with these elections in actually September to November for a new president. I think I think a lot of people are pessimistic about where that's going to go, what's going to come out of that.
What about the Army's role in this? I mean, I've heard sort of varying opinions on this, but one opinion I thought very interesting, that Lebanese opinion is perhaps still out in a conclusive sense on the Army's role, but strongly interested in this. I mean, the Army has taken a strong stance and hasn't been noted for doing that in the past. And they may be, I'm not going to go as far as to say the savior of stability or anything, but they are making what many think is a stronger effort to keep the country together. I think what we saw in the fighting up north, in the Palestinian refugee camp near Tripoli, there was nobody really criticizing the military. I mean, no one's going to defend the Palestinians, sadly, in Lebanon these days. They're some of the most vulnerable, mistreated people in that country. But I think among Lebanese, there was no criticism of the military. And I think what we're dealing with, like you made that point, I think the military is a truly national institution, one of the very few in the country at this point. When you look at its rank and file, they're often Shiites from the Bekaa Valley or Sunni Muslims from northern Lebanon, from Akkar.
there's a cross-sectarian kind of representation within the military itself, and so I think that helps create the idea of it being a national institution. What is its future? And let's face it, didn't do very well up in northern Lebanon. It didn't perform all that well, but it has performed, I think, better in some of in preventing a civil war from erupting from these conflicts, the more strategic conflict that I've been talking about earlier.
The key question, because of that brutal 15-year conflict before, you don't see things going in that.
Well, it disintegrated twice during that conflict, the Lebanese army, and I think if it ever blew up again in Lebanon, and the army couldn't stop it, it would probably disintegrate again along sectarian lines. Hopefully not, but I think that's what everybody would probably expect. But there's also kind of a, Lebanese politics are often about personalities, and I think there's another notion that the head of the army is a possible presidential candidate. So the army plays a maybe more dynamic role in some ways, in that regard as well.
Two of the ancillary costs of all this, Anthony, at least possibly, it would seem to me, are first of all, this terrible half-century-old or more Palestinian refugee crisis that is like a canker within the entire region, but specifically within Lebanon. That remains a great risk and a source of great trouble. And then, of course, obviously, this, I would think, paralyzes Lebanon's ability to adopt a coherent stance toward Israel or any other country in the region.
I think so, and I think that's, Lebanon is a victim of the conflicts that surround it. It also does a lot to create the conflicts on its own within the country. I mean, Lebanese are not blameless by any means, but it is very much tied up in those conflicts that do surround it. And the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is one, of course. The struggle between the United States and Iran is another. The United States and Syria, and in some ways, it is at the nexus of all these different struggles. But when we talk about the situation, I mean, a 50-year-old problem, the Palestinian refugee problem. One of the stories that I reported on a couple of months ago was going to the Jordanian border, Jordanian-Iraqi border, and on that border there's probably about 115 Palestinians who were forced to flee Iraq back in 2003, and they've been living in this camp on the border in tents for going on 4 years now. Not only were they stateless from their original homes in Palestine, they were stateless again from their homes in Iraq, and they're sitting there living in tents for more than 4 years on the border. And not only was the situation in itself so bleak, it was so bleak in that there was very little hope for for somehow it to be resolved.
God, I don't even know what to say to that. That's been this continues to be, to me, the most anguished of all the problems in the region in terms of destinies.
And I think it still rests in some ways at the heart of all the problems as well.
Exactly. I concur with that completely, Anthony. Another aspect of the current issues in the region, I think you mentioned it also in your last answer, is the status of Iran. And by way of framing this question, I think I can quote, if not quote this, it certainly came through your reportage on Middle Eastern attitudes about the region from people living in it. And the phrase that stuck in my mind was that many Middle Easterners are now seeing Iran as, quote, the ascendant country in the region. And there's a degree of irony about that, because to carry that further, the argument goes that America's intervention in Iraq and in Afghanistan has, ironically, served to sort of take care of two of Iran's major antagonists and bring it to its current prominence.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. Iran almost went to war with the Taliban in the late 1990s. It did go to war with Iraq in the 1980s. And, in successive invasions, the United States toppled, two of Iraq's, historic foes in a way, Iran's historic foes in a way. And that definitely did change the strategic balance in the region. I think, Iran. I think the Iranian leaders will often still see what they're, is this an aggressive policy to create, to become supreme or to, triumphant in the region? Perhaps, who knows their real intentions? But I think a lot of Iranian leaders would portray this as a defensive. They're trying to defend themselves against American ambitions in the region as well. They have legitimate national interests in Afghanistan and Iraq. They are neighbors, after all, of Iran. But it's a very pitched conflict, I think. I think it's a conflict that's being fought through proxies in a lot of respects in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iraq, of course. And in some ways, I think Iran has the upper hand. I think when people see that, when Arabs will say that they believe Iran has the upper hand, there's some truth to that.
Is one manifestation of that Iran's support for, and perhaps even more than support for, the Shiite militancy that's seen in the region?
I think this is where it becomes very interesting. I was talking to an Iranian diplomat in Lebanon about this, and he was, making the point that this is the last thing that they would want to encourage, because it would take, the minute that Iran's interests become associated solely with Shiite ambitions in the region, then they lose any idea of having, the Arab world still remains predominantly Sunni region. So once Iranian policy becomes too closely associated with Shiite ambitions, then I think the Iranians lose a lot of standing in the region. So they've resisted that. They see this, they will describe this as an American plot, quote unquote, trying to create the Sunni-Shiite divide as a way of taking away Iranian prestige or Iranian power. There is that impact. That does happen. The more that this sectarian divide becomes sharpened or becomes deepened, I think that does happen. I think the perception, in a lot of ways, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think the perception in a lot of ways among Arabs that Iran is ascendant is not so much Iran being ascendant, but what is being seen as the impact of U.S. policy at this point. In Iraq and Palestine, we're on the verge of civil war. Lebanon, again, the verge of civil war. Iraq is in a civil war. I mean, I think, are the Americans responsible solely for this? No, but I think they're associated with the fate of these countries, and that has, it's been debilitating for American standing, I think, in the region at this point.
I think that's a very important finding. Anthony, as we come toward the conclusion of our conversation, I want to ask about a theme that seems to me to have run through everything we've talked about today, runs through the books, and that is this, that all of this in one way or another, and perhaps in ways that cohere and as well as stand separately, what we have underway here is sort of a massive search for identity in the region, that people are attempting to define themselves, with or without an American presence or American policies. That the real question, the fundamental question being awkwardly or skillfully addressed is, where do we go from here?
I think that's exactly right. I think this is very much of a post-colonial experience that we're seeing in the Arab world, is how do Arabs identify themselves? And I think there was the period of Arab nationalism, there's been the ascent of political Islam, there's been a growing sectarian divide that we're seeing today. That question remains unanswered. It remains unanswered in a place like Lebanon, it remains unanswered in a place like Iraq. But the resolution of that question of how we identify ourselves and how we express ourselves then politically does, in a lot of ways, I think, lay the roadmap for the future of both the region and the individual states that reside there.
And I think we're going to have to count on you to keep us on that roadmap. And as you've done so well, Anthony, thank you for this conversation and for the wonderful reportage.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Anthony, thank you.
That was my pleasure.
It's tremendous.